Imagine it's March 2024. You're a registered nurse named Maria in Phoenix, Arizona. You've worked at the same hospital for 6 years. You make $62,000 a year. That's more than your mother ever made. More than anyone in your family has ever made, adjusted for inflation. And yet, you open your mailbox and find a letter from your apartment complex. Not the complex you chose, exactly. You signed your lease with a local property management company 3 years ago. Then they were bought. Then the new company was bought. Now your rent checks go to a Delaware LLC with 17 letters in its name that you cannot pronounce. The letter is brief. Your lease renewal is offered at a 12% increase. 12%. In 1 year. You do the math in your head. You already spend 41% of your take-home pay on rent. This increase would push you to 46%. The financial planning advice you read online says housing should be 30% of income. You passed that threshold 4 years ago. You consider your options. Move somewhere cheaper. But you heck the listings and discover something that doesn't make sense. Every apartment in the city, in every neighborhood, at every quality level, has increased by almost exactly the same percentage. It's as if someone coordinated it. You're not wrong. What you're experiencing isn't a market. It's a system. And that system was not designed to house you. It was designed to service debt. This isn't theory. It's documented history. And once you understand the mechanics, you'll realize something unsettling. Your rent is not going down. Not next year, not in 2026, not ever. Not because landlords are greedy, not because of immigration, not because of avocado toast millennials failing to save. Your rent cannot go down because the entire American housing system is now structured on a foundation that would collapse if prices declined. Let me show you exactly how this works. The popular explanation for rising rent is simple. Too many people, not enough housing. Supply and demand. Economics 101. Build more apartments and prices will fall. It's intuitive, it feels true. Politicians on both sides repeat this explanation. Developers repeat it. Economists repeat it. And at the surface level, it's not entirely wrong. America does have a housing shortage. Estimates range from 3 million to 7 million units, depending on who's counting and what they're counting. But here's what that explanation misses. Housing construction in America did not collapse because builders forgot how to build. It collapsed because building affordable housing became mathematically impossible. And that impossibility was engineered. There's another popular explanation: greedy landlords, corporate greed. If we just regulate them, cap rent increases, punish the price gougers, the problem will solve itself. This explanation is emotionally satisfying. It identifies a villain, but it also misses the mechanism. Most landlords, especially corporate landlords, are not choosing to raise rent out of malice. They are required to raise rent to service debt obligations that were calculated based on projected rent increases. If they don't raise rent, they default. If they default, someone else buys the property at a similar valuation and faces the same requirement. The greed isn't the cause. The greed is the symptom. The cause is structural. There's a third explanation: temporary inflation. The argument goes like this. COVID disrupted supply chains. Governments printed money. Inflation spiked. Rent followed. But inflation has cooled since 2022. The Fed raised rates. Prices should be stabilizing. Except rent isn't stabilizing. Even as general inflation fell from 9% to 3%, rent growth remained elevated. In many cities, it accelerated. This divergence reveals something important. Rent is no longer tethered to inflation, wages, or local economic conditions. Rent is tethered to something else entirely. To understand what's actually happening to American rent, that occurred between 2008 and 2024. Each one alone would have increased housing costs. Together, they created a system that cannot reverse. The first change, the financialization of housing. Before 2008, most single-family rental homes were owned by individuals, small landlords, people who owned 1 or 2 properties as investments or side income. Apartment buildings were often owned by local developers or regional companies. Then came the financial crisis. When the housing market collapsed in 2008 and 2009, millions of homes went into foreclosure. Banks needed to sell these properties, but there were few individual buyers. Credit had tightened. Confidence had collapsed. Properties sat vacant, dragging down entire neighborhoods. The federal government faced a choice. Let the market clear naturally, which would mean years of depressed prices and neighborhood blight, or find buyers with enough capital to absorb millions of homes quickly. They chose the second option. In 2012, the Federal Housing Finance Agency launched the REO to Rental Pilot Program. REO stands for Real Estate Owned, the term for foreclosed properties held by banks. The program allowed large institutional investors to purchase pools of foreclosed homes in bulk at significant discounts. Private equity firms saw an opportunity. Blackstone, through its subsidiary Invitation Homes, began purchasing single-family houses by the thousands. By 2013, they were buying 500 homes per week in markets like Phoenix, Atlanta, and Las Vegas. They weren't buying these homes to flip them or sell them. They were buying them to rent them forever. This was new. Single-family rental housing had never been institutionalized at this scale. The logistics were complex. Managing thousands of geographically dispersed properties requires sophisticated systems for maintenance, rent collection, tenant screening, and lease enforcement. But private equity had the capital to build these systems. And they had something else: cheap debt. The Federal Reserve had pushed interest rates to near zero in response to the financial crisis. Large institutions could borrow money at rates unavailable to individual buyers. This gave them a permanent advantage in any bidding war. By 2024, institutional investors owned approximately 3% of all single-family homes in America. That sounds small, but it's concentrated. In certain markets, in certain zip codes, in certain price ranges, institutional ownership exceeds 30%. These aren't random houses. They're the houses in the middle of the market. The houses that young families and first-time buyers would otherwise purchase. The houses that form the first rung of the wealth-building ladder that previous generations climbed. That ladder has been pulled up. In 2017, a company called RealPage began offering a service called YieldStar to property managers. The pitch was simple. Instead of setting rent based on local knowledge, gut feeling, or individual negotiations, let an algorithm analyze market data and recommend optimal pricing. What the algorithm actually did was coordinate pricing across competitors. Here's how it worked. Property managers from competing companies all fed their data into the same system: vacancy rates, renewal rates, asking rents, accepted rents. The algorithm analyzed this data and recommended prices that maximized revenue across the entire market, not just for individual properties. In any other industry, this would be called price fixing. Competitors sharing pricing information and coordinating prices is illegal under antitrust law, but RealPage argued it was just software, just analytics, just recommendations. By 2023, RealPage software was influencing rent pricing for over 16 million apartment units across the United States. That's roughly 30% of all apartments. A ProPublica investigation in 2022 documented how the system worked. In one example, a property manager received a recommendation to increase rent by 14%. The manager thought this was too aggressive. The market couldn't bear it. But the algorithm insisted. The manager raised rent. Tenants paid. The algorithm was right, in a narrow sense. Tenants did pay, because every other property in the area was raising rent by the same percentage, using the same algorithm, feeding the same data. There was nowhere else to go. In November 2023, the Department of Justice filed an antitrust lawsuit against RealPage. Several state attorneys general filed similar suits. But even if RealPage loses, even if the specific algorithm is banned, the infrastructure remains. The data sharing networks remain. The institutional incentive to coordinate remains. The algorithm will simply move to a different platform or operate more discreetly. The behavior is structural. It cannot be regulated away without restructuring the market itself. The third structural change, the debt service floor. This is the most important change and the least discussed. When an institutional investor purchases a property, they typically finance 70 to 80% of the purchase with debt. This debt is not free. It carries an interest rate. It requires monthly payments. Those payments must be covered by rental income. When interest rates were near zero, this math was forgiving. An investor could buy a property at a high price, charge moderate rent, and still cover debt service with room to spare. But here's the trap. The properties purchased between 2012 and 2022 were purchased at prices that assumed rent would continue rising. The debt was structured around projected rent increases of 3 to 5% annually, compounded. If rent stops rising, the math breaks. An investor who bought an apartment building in 2021 at a 4% cap rate, financed at 3% interest, is now facing refinancing at 7% interest. The monthly payment doubles, but the rent cannot double. Tenants cannot pay double. So the investor faces a choice. Option 1, raise rent as aggressively as possible to close the gap. Option 2, default on the debt and lose the property. Option 3, sell the property at a loss. There's no option 4. There is no option where rent decreases. If the investor chooses option 1, rents rise. If they choose option 2, the property is purchased by someone else at a lower price, but that buyer also finances with debt and faces the same pressure to maximize rent. If they choose option 3, the new buyer has the same incentives. The entire system has a floor built into it. That floor is the cost of debt service, and that floor rises every time interest rates rise, every time property taxes rise, every time insurance costs rise. In 2023, property insurance costs in Florida increased by 40%. In Texas, 30%. In California, many insurers stopped offering coverage entirely. These costs are passed directly to tenants. The floor keeps rising, and it cannot fall without mass defaults. Let that sink in. Now I need to show you something that ties all of this together, something that explains why this system, once established, cannot reverse itself. The hidden mechanism is the feedback loop between asset prices and debt. Here's how it works. When housing prices rise, existing owners gain equity. They can borrow against that equity. They can use that borrowing to purchase additional properties. This increases demand for housing, which increases prices, which increases equity, which enables more borrowing. This is called asset price inflation. It feels like wealth creation. Homeowners feel richer. Landlords feel richer. Banks feel safer because their collateral has appreciated. But it's not wealth creation. It's wealth transfer. Every dollar of increased home equity for an owner is a dollar of increased lifetime rent for someone who doesn't own. The mechanism also works through rents directly. When institutional investors value their properties, they use a method called capitalization rate, or cap rate. The cap rate is the ratio of rental income to property value. A property that generates $100,000 in annual rent and is valued at $2 million has a 5% cap rate. Now watch carefully. If the cap rate stays constant, increasing rent increases property value proportionally. A 10% rent increase creates a 10% property value increase. This increased value allows the owner to borrow more against the property. That additional borrowing can be used to purchase additional properties, which reduces housing supply, which increases rents. This is a positive feedback loop. Each turn of the cycle increases prices further. Here's why it cannot reverse. If rents decrease, property values decrease. If property values decrease, owners have less equity. If they have less equity, they may be underwater on their mortgages. If they're underwater, they default. If they default, banks take losses. If banks take enough losses, they fail. If banks fail, credit tightens. If credit tightens, buyers disappear. If buyers disappear, prices fall further. This is the 2008 scenario. This is what the entire system is designed to prevent. The Federal Reserve exists in large part to ensure this deflationary spiral never happens again. Every tool they have is oriented towards supporting asset prices. They will cut rates, buy bonds, inject liquidity, bail out banks before they will allow a sustained decline in housing prices. This isn't conspiracy. This is stated policy. In 2020, when COVID threatened asset prices, the Federal Reserve injected $4 trillion into financial markets within weeks. Asset prices recovered within months. Rents followed. The message was clear. The floor will be defended. None of this is new. The financialization of housing has happened before. The outcomes are documented. In the 1920s, Germany faced a severe housing shortage. The war had destroyed stock. Returning soldiers needed housing. The government responded with rent controls, attempting to keep housing affordable. The controls worked briefly, but they created a secondary effect. Landlords could not profit from rental properties, so they stopped maintaining them. They stopped building new ones. Capital fled the housing sector. When the controls were eventually lifted in the late 1920s, rents exploded. The housing that existed was in disrepair. The housing that should have been built didn't exist. An entire generation was priced out. The mechanism was different, but the outcome was similar. Policy interventions that address symptoms while ignoring structure make the underlying problem worse. In the 1980s, Japan experienced an asset bubble of historic proportions. Real estate prices in Tokyo rose so high that the land under the imperial palace was theoretically worth more than all the real estate in California. When the bubble burst in 1991, Japan chose not to allow mass defaults. Banks were propped up. Zombie companies were kept alive. Asset prices were defended. The result was 30 years of stagnation. Prices never crashed. They also never recovered. An entire generation came of age in an economy that felt permanently frozen. America looked at Japan and learned a lesson, but perhaps the wrong lesson. The lesson American policymakers took was prevent deflation at all costs. What they missed was preventing deflation also means preventing affordability. In Venezuela, housing policy took a different turn. The government instituted strict rent controls and tenant protections in the 2000s. Landlords could not evict. Rents could not rise. On paper, housing was affordable. In practice, the formal housing market collapsed. No one would build rental housing when rents were capped below construction costs. No one would rent a property when tenants couldn't be removed. The housing stock that existed deteriorated. An informal market emerged. Off-the-books payments, key money, bribes. The actual cost of housing arose even as official rents stayed low. And the people who suffered most were those without connections, without cash for bribes, without access to the informal system. Again, the mechanism differed. Again, the outcome echoed. These historical examples share a common thread. When housing is treated as a policy variable to be controlled rather than a market to be structured, unintended consequences compound. When housing is treated as a pure financial asset to be maximized, social consequences follow. America has done both simultaneously. The result is a system that optimizes for neither affordability nor profit, but for debt service. Every system produces winners. Understanding who benefits reveals how the system maintains itself. The primary beneficiaries of the American housing system are existing owners. If you bought a house in Phoenix in 2015, your property has approximately tripled in value. You have accumulated hundreds of thousands of dollars in equity by doing nothing except making mortgage payments. That equity can be borrowed against, passed to children, or realized upon sale. This wealth accumulation feels earned. You took a risk. You bought a house. You were right. But the wealth didn't materialize from nothing. Every dollar of your appreciation came from somewhere. It came from future buyers, who will pay more. It came from renters, whose landlords' property values rose. It came from an entire generation priced out of ownership. The second tier of beneficiaries are institutional investors. Blackstone's Invitation Homes has generated returns exceeding 20% annually since its inception. Their investors, primarily pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and wealthy individuals, have accumulated billions in profits from rent extracted from American tenants. These profits are legal, they're reported, they're taxed, mostly. But they represent a fundamental transfer of wealth from people who need shelter to people who own the means of providing it. The third tier of beneficiaries are mortgage lenders and financial institutions. Every mortgage generates fees, every refinance generates fees, every home equity line of credit generates fees. As home prices rise, loan sizes rise. As loan sizes rise, fees rise. The entire financial sector profits from housing inflation. The fourth tier of beneficiaries are local governments. Property taxes are typically calculated as a percentage of assessed value. As values rise, tax revenue rises. Local governments become dependent on this revenue. They have no incentive to reduce housing costs. Lower costs mean lower revenue. Lower revenue means fewer services or higher tax rates. This creates a structural opposition to affordability. Even well-meaning local officials face a budget constraint that punishes lower housing costs. Notice who is missing from this list of beneficiaries: renters, first-time buyers, young workers, anyone not already in the system. This is not accidental. The system is designed to benefit those already inside it at the expense of those outside. The insiders vote, they donate, they lobby, they show up at zoning meetings. The outsiders move, or they don't form households, or they live with roommates, or they stay with parents, or they leave. The costs of this system are distributed across millions of individuals, making them hard to see in aggregate, but they are real. The most obvious cost is financial. Americans now spend more of their income on housing than at any point in measured history. In 1950, the median household spent roughly 20% of income on housing. By 2000, it was 30%. By 2024, it exceeds 40% in major metropolitan areas. This leaves less money for everything else, less savings, less investment, less consumption of goods and services, less financial resilience when emergencies strike. But the financial cost is not the deepest cost. The deeper cost is demographic. When housing costs consume 40% of income, family formation declines, birth rates decline. Not because people don't want families, but because they cannot afford the space. The United States birth rate fell to a historic low in 2023. There are many factors contributing to this decline, but housing affordability is consistently cited as a primary factor in surveys. Young people are not choosing to remain childless, they are being priced out of parenthood. There's also a geographic cost. When housing costs in productive cities become unaffordable, workers relocate to cheaper areas. These cheaper areas are often cheaper for a reason: fewer jobs, lower wages, less economic dynamism. This represents a massive misallocation of human capital. A talented engineer who could contribute to a growing company in San Francisco instead works a lower productivity job in a smaller city because housing is affordable there. The productivity loss is invisible but substantial. There's a social cost. Communities require stability to form, and when tenants are constantly displaced by rent increases, social bonds fray. Neighborhoods lose continuity. Churches lose congregations. Schools lose students. The informal networks that make communities function dissolve. This is hard to quantify, but anyone who has lived in a neighborhood experiencing rapid turnover has felt it. And there's a political cost. When young people cannot afford housing, they lose faith in the system. They lose faith in work. They lose faith in institutions. Survey data consistently shows that economic pessimism among young Americans has reached historic highs. When asked whether hard work leads to success, millennials and Gen Z respond with skepticism at rates far exceeding previous generations. This is not entitlement, it's pattern recognition. They worked hard. They did what they were told. They still can't afford a house. The system broke its promise. This is the section that matters most, the section that explains why I'm not offering solutions. For rent to decrease meaningfully, one of the following must occur. Option 1, mass construction of new housing supply, exceeding demand for years until prices fall. This is the economist's preferred solution. But it runs into hard constraints. Construction costs have risen dramatically. Labor, materials, land, permits, insurance, legal fees. A new apartment building in a major city costs hundreds of thousands of dollars per unit to construct. Even if zoning were eliminated tomorrow, Market rate developers cannot build housing affordable to median income renters without subsidy. The math doesn't work. It hasn't worked for decades. Additionally, existing homeowners oppose new construction near their properties. This is called NIMBYism, not in my backyard. It operates at every level of government: zoning boards, city councils, state legislatures. The people who vote, the people who donate, the people who show up at meetings are owners. They oppose anything that might reduce their property values. This is not irrational on their part. Their housing wealth is often their primary retirement asset. They are protecting their futures, but their rational behavior in aggregate creates an irrational system. Option 2, mass defaults and a collapse in property values. This would make housing affordable eventually after a period of severe economic disruption, the 2008 scenario. But the entire financial system is oriented toward preventing this. The Federal Reserve will intervene, banks will be bailed out, asset prices will be defended. They've proven this repeatedly: 2008, 2020, 2023 with regional bank failures. The political will to allow housing prices to fall does not exist. Too many voters own houses, too many banks hold mortgages, too many pension funds hold mortgage-backed securities. The system will defend the floor. Option 3, government intervention to provide affordable housing outside the market. This is the Vienna model. In Vienna, Austria, approximately 60% of residents live in subsidized housing. The government built massive amounts of public housing in the 20th century. Rents are controlled. Quality is maintained. Market rate housing exists alongside public housing, keeping market rents moderated through competition. This works. Vienna consistently ranks among the most livable cities in the world. Housing affordability is a major factor, but America cannot become Vienna. The institutional infrastructure doesn't exist. The political coalition doesn't exist. The fiscal capacity at the necessary scale doesn't exist. American public housing projects in the mid-20th century were systematically defunded, neglected, and demolished. The political memory of that failure haunts any proposal for new public housing. The government-built alternative has been politically killed. Option 4, inflation erodes real housing costs while nominal prices remain stable. This is arguably what happened in the 1970s. High inflation meant that housing costs, while rising nominally, fell in real terms for some borrowers. Fixed-rate mortgage payments became easier to afford as wages rose with inflation. But this requires sustained high inflation, which imposes its own costs. And it requires wages to keep pace with inflation, which has not happened consistently in recent decades. Additionally, rents adjust to inflation faster than wages. So inflation may erode the real cost of ownership while increasing the real cost of renting. This is not a solution. It's a redistribution of pain. Option 5. A generation simply accepts permanent renting and housing insecurity as the baseline condition. This is what's actually happening. Home ownership rates among Americans under 35 have declined steadily for decades. The expectation of ownership, once central to the American dream, is fading. This isn't acceptance through resignation. It's acceptance through the absence of alternatives. The system ends with a generation that never enters it. You might be asking why this matters specifically in 2025 and 2026. Several converging factors are about to intensify the pressure. First, a wall of commercial real estate debt is coming due. Approximately $2 trillion in commercial mortgages will need to be refinanced between 2024 and 2027. Much of this debt was originated when interest rates were near zero. It must now be refinanced at rates roughly double. Many commercial property owners will face the same impossible choice residential owners face: raise rents, default, or sell. Many will raise rents. The ones who own apartment buildings will raise residential rents. Second, insurance costs are accelerating. Climate change is not a future risk. It's a present cost. Insurers are repricing risk in real time. Florida homeowners, insurance premiums tripled between 2019 and 2024. Texas, Louisiana, and California are experiencing similar trends. These costs are passed to renters immediately. Unlike mortgages, which are fixed, leases can be adjusted annually. Third, property taxes are catching up to market values. Assessments lag market prices, sometimes by years. The property tax bills for homes purchased or revalued in 2021 and 2022 are just now arriving. Landlords who bought at peak prices are just now receiving tax bills calculated on those prices. Again, these costs pass directly to tenants. Fourth, household formation is recovering from COVID disruption. During the pandemic, many young people moved in with parents or roommates. Household formation plummeted. This temporarily reduced housing demand. Those young people are now forming independent households. They need housing. They're competing for a supply that didn't grow during the pandemic. Pent-up demand is hitting a static supply. Fifth, construction activity has slowed in response to higher interest rates. When rates rose in 2022 and 2023, construction financing became more expensive. Many projects were delayed or canceled. The housing units that would have been completed in 2025 and 2026 were not started. The The supply that should be arriving isn't coming. These 5 factors, debt refinancing, insurance costs, property tax reassessments, household formation, and construction slowdown, are converging simultaneously. This is not a forecast. It's arithmetic. This is historical and educational analysis. Nothing in this video should be construed as financial advice, investment guidance, or a recommendation to take any specific action regarding housing, renting, or purchasing. The purpose of this analysis is to explain the structure of a system, not to predict its future movements or advise on personal financial decisions. Consult qualified professionals for any financial decisions. Let me return to Maria, the nurse in Phoenix, the one holding the lease renewal letter. She can move, but she'll find the same prices elsewhere. She can negotiate, but the algorithm doesn't negotiate. She can complain, but the landlord is servicing debt, not making choices. She can vote, but the owners outnumber the renters at every meeting. She's not facing a bad actor. She's facing a system. The system was built over decades. It was built through financialization, through algorithmic coordination, through debt accumulation, through political capture. Each piece was legal. Each decision was rational for the actor making it. And yet the outcome is a generation priced out of shelter. This is how systems fail. Not through villainy, but through structure. Not through conspiracy, but through incentive alignment. Not through malice, but through math. The rent will not go down because it cannot go down without triggering a cascade that every powerful actor in the system is aligned to prevent. This is not a prediction of collapse. Collapse is not the most likely outcome. The most likely outcome is continuation, gradual adjustment, each generation accepting a little less, each renter paying a little more, each owner a little wealthier on paper. The system will persist because it benefits those with the power to change it, and it will persist until the moment it doesn't. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. The housing systems that seem most permanent often prove most fragile. Rome's latifundia seemed eternal until they weren't. European feudal tenure seemed permanent until it wasn't. American slavery seemed economically invincible until it wasn't. Systems built on extraction always find their limit. The question isn't whether. The question is when and what replaces them. For now, the pattern is in motion. The mechanism is visible. The outcome is arithmetic. The only question left is how long the arithmetic takes to reach you. This channel exists to trace the mechanics of systems before they reach their conclusions. If you found this analysis useful, consider subscribing. Not for entertainment, for pattern recognition. Because most people don't see the structure until they're already inside it. And by then, the structure has already done its work.